Brilliant morning. Beautiful day in the neighborhood. Good morning. Glad to have you with me. This is what it takes to be able to stand on your unalienable rights. It takes a lot of dedication. There are many mornings I wake up at 3, 4, 5 in the morning. Nothing else to do. I'm bored. Starving and craving knowledge, of course. Waking up ignorant. We begin to read some books. So this book here is of the de facto doctrines and of public offices and officers in general. This book was again shared with me by Mr. Anonymous. As always, just want to extend a nice courteous thank you to Mr. Anonymous for the guidance he provides to all of us while remaining on the private side. Doesn't wish to be known, doesn't really care to be recognized, because after all, it's not what it's about. And I'm starting to understand why he doesn't want to engage with the general populace. I get it. It's kind of a headache. Subsection 1, definitions of the de facto doctrine. The de facto doctrine is a rule or principle of law which, in the first place, justifies the recognition of the authority of governments established and maintained by persons who have usurped the sovereign authority of the state and assert themselves by force and arms against the lawful government. Secondly, which recognizes the existence of and protects from collateral attack, public or private bodies corporate, which, though irregularly or illegally organized, yet under color of law, openly exercise the powers and functions of regularly created bodies. And thirdly, which impart validity to the official acts of persons who, under color of right or authority, hold office under the aforementioned governments or bodies, or exercise lawfully existing offices of whatever nature, in which the public or third person are interested, where the performance of such officials' acts, okay? So let's talk about what we're reading here. Acts is an act or an action or acting as though. Okay, if I act like Derek, am I Derek or am I acting like Derek? Okay, and the next thing I want to point out is color of law. If we're doing things under color of law, it's a symbolism of law. It mimics law. It has the appearance of law, but may or may not, in fact, be law, okay? There are some attributes of color of law that although they closely mimic law, are not, in fact, law at all, and never could be, okay? So I want you guys to understand what is transpiring here. And again, this is the de facto doctrine. Remember how I keep telling you guys that I operate off of sound principle and doctrine, okay? It's very, very important. So acts is for the benefit of the public or third person and not for their own personal advantage. The doctrine is grounded upon consideration of public policy. Public policy, ladies and gentlemen, again, not being law, okay? Justice and necessity. Now, here's where I keep talking about equity and why the public de facto is so jealous of equity, is because inequity out of necessity, our rights trump their policy, okay? And this is designed to protect the shield from injury injury the community at large or private individuals who innocently or through coercion submit to, acknowledge, or invoke the authority assumed by the government's corporate bodies or officers above mentioned. While this definition may be susceptible of improvements, yet we think it accurately and sufficiently embodies the leading features and scope of the de facto doctrine. Singularly enough, notwithstanding the abundance of literature written upon this subject by judges and text writers, no general definition embracing the whole ground covered by the doctrine has, so far as we are aware, ever been attempted. Subsection 2. Same subject. The first part of the above definition, as is obvious, relates to the de facto governments and the de facto corporations, Title 28, 3002, 15a, okay, and its subsidiary corporations and municipalities thereof. The second, to the functioneers of such governments and corporations and to the ordinary illegal officers, okay, and to the ordinary illegal officers. The two classes of irregular officers are included together because the same color of title or authority is requisites to constitute an officer de facto under a de facto government or a de facto corporation, as is required under ordinary circumstances. It is true that the functionaries of the first class can never become more than de facto officers. However, regular their appointment and qualifications may be, because the offices they hold are tainted with the same illegality as the power which gave them birth, or under which they are held. But nevertheless, were a person to take charge of such an office without at least color of authority, he would be regarded as a mere usurper. Now, you remember, when I'm talking to these public officials, I want their delegation of authority to operate outside of Washington, D.C., because they're making legal determinations on the side of the road. I want their rights, duties, and obligations, and I want to know that they are compliant with the Foreign Registration Act of 1938, because to take a foreign oath makes them a foreigner on my land, and they need to have a delegation of authority again to operate outside of Washington, D.C. with a W-7, W-8, W-9, EIN, TIN number. They must be independently bonded, and this is the reason why. Now, when I look at these agents and agency, and I mean no disrespect to them, when I ask them for these things, they get a starry-eyed glaze in their eyes. They just don't quite comprehend what I speak of, okay? And this shows me that the establishment for where they receive their education is intentionally derelict in their duty to inform these men and women what they're truly doing. You see, we never have to worry about in America being invaded by the Chinese, by the Japanese, by the Canadians, by the Mexicans. We don't ever have to worry about a foreign army invasion, for what they did was they polluted the minds of many Americans and converted them into their standing army on our soil by removing them as being no longer Americans, but foreigners on our land who speak our language, look like us, talk like us, move like us, but yet are not we the people any longer due to their indoctrination. Okay? And his acts could not be upheld on any consideration. It must also be remembered that the de facto corporations are of two kinds: those organized for the benefit of the public and generally denominated municipal or quasi-municipal, and those incorporated for private ends or purposes. With private de facto corporations and their officers, however, it is not our intention to deal in this work, though the principles applicable to these are generally identical with the rules which obtain in regard to the de facto public corporation and their officials. Our purpose is to confine ourselves to a consideration and discussion of the de facto doctrine in its relation to the public officers, and, incidentally, to treat to treat of de facto public corporations, de facto governments, and other collateral subjects. Subsection 3, necessity of the de facto doctrine. The necessity of the de facto doctrine becomes manifest from whatever aspect it is viewed. As regards the public and third persons, it would be unreasonable to expect them to inquire beforehand into the title of the officer with whom they purpose to deal, to ascertain whether or not reliance can be placed on their assumed authority. Okay, remember, it's a color of authority. It's assumed authority. Assuming the authority doesn't mean they have a delegation of authority, and that's why it's imperative to ask for their delegation of authority to operate outside of Washington, D.C. We need 3 forms of ID. We need their oath of office. We need their bonds. We need their anti-bribery statements. We need their foreign registration certificate, which they should be compliant with, their W-7s, W-8s, W-9s, EINs, and TINs for the principal they're working for and theirs. We also want their assumed registered business name. If they have a placard on their chest that says B. Gonzalez, initialing their first name, it shows intent to do business under deceptive trade practices using a false and fictitious unregistered DBA because they actually have the placard, okay? And by having that placard show that they had intent to do business in that false and fictitious misleading name, and to abscond from the truth of having a duty and an obligation and being duty bound to register that trade name with the Secretary of State or get the assumed business name through the Secretary of State. Are you following me here? Ladies and gentlemen, I can prove what I'm telling you, all right? This would be making the validity of their official acts dependent on their official titles, which would be intolerable. On the other hand, were every officer bound to uphold or defend his title against everyone who might choose to deny or attack it in a collateral way, he would often be so much thwarted in the performance of his official duties that his efficiency as an officer might at times be greatly impaired. Again, the doctrine is necessary to maintain the supremacy of the law and to preserve peace and determine and or in the community at large. Since any other rule would lead to such uncertainty and confusion as to break up the order, excuse me, and quiet of all civil administrations. Indeed, if any individual or body of individuals were permitted at his or their pleasure to challenge the authority of and refuse obedience to the government of the state and the numerous functionaries through whom it exercises its various powers, or refuse to recognize municipal bodies and their officers on the ground of irregular existence or defective titles, insubordination and disorder of the worst kind would be encouraged, which might at any time culminate in anarchy. Now, they speak of anarchy as though it is something pompously grotesque. But let me tell you something. Anarchy is not the absence of belief of government. Anarchy is the belief of self-governance, the ability to govern oneself and hold oneself accountable, okay, and conduct themselves properly. So the word anarchy, according to like the news media and the publishers, obviously, and here, would lead you to believe that anarchy would lead to mass confusion, mass manipulation, and an array of people who are not accountable or liable for their actions, when in truth, anarchy is not the lack of government, it's more the reliance of self-governance and knowing the difference between right and wrong, okay? These are substantially the views expressed by all the authorities, both English and American, in Skating versus Laurent. In the House of Lords, the Lord Chancellor, dealing with the authority vestrymen de facto to make a rate said, with regard to the competency of the vestrymen who were vestrymen de facto, but not vestrymen de jure, to make the rate, your lordship will see at once the importance of that objection. When you consider how many public officers and persons there are who are charged with very important duties and whose titles to the office on the part of the public cannot be ascertained at the time, you will at once see to what it would lead if the validity of their acts when in such office depended upon the property of their election. It might tend, if doubts were cast upon them, to consequences of the most destructive kind. It would create uncertainty with respect to the obedience to public officers, and it might also lead to persons, instead of sorting to the ordinary legal remedies to set anything right done by the officers, taking the law into their own hands. Now they're talking about vigilantes. The language of Mr. Justice Field delivering the opinion of the Supreme Court of the United States in Norton versus Shell by county is to the same effect. The Doctrine says, bear with me, learned judge, which gives validity to acts of officers de facto, whatever defects there may be in the legality of their appointment or election, is founded upon consideration of policy and necessity for the protection of the public and individuals whose interests may be affected thereby. Offices are created for the benefit of the public, and private parties are not permitted to inquire into the title of persons clothed with the evidence of such office and in apparent possession of their powers and functions. For the good order and peace of society, their authority is to be respected and obeyed until, in some regular mode prescribed by law, their title is investigated and determined. It is manifest that endless confusion would result if in every proceeding before such officer their title could be called into question. Now, everybody's title should be called into question, and how we properly assert ourselves and call into question the title. And that's what was so important with the Founding Fathers, the 13th Amendment, the titles of nobility. When we look at investigating that further, we should always know their rights, titles, duties, and obligations. Morally, I have rights, duties, titles, and obligations. I have an obligation to make an observation, create a record, and report it, okay? And we have the ability to hold our own court, which supersedes the Supreme Court. And what they're talking about in here is by questioning their color of authority, society may run awry, may run amok. This knowledge isn't for everybody, ladies and gentlemen. It tells us in the good book, and it tells us in the Holy Bible, that only 144,000 tribes of 12,000 people of peace will know thy truth. Okay, we'll see this and comprehend what it is. You know, the government was put in place, identified as the rods of God, to lead us who have been led astray back to God, okay? Because everything that man does with his free will, one of the best ways that we can learn is we learn from our pain, not from our pleasure, right? And God knew this to be true, so he made sure that there was going to be implemented governments among men to lead them back home, to lead them back to his good word. You see, we were all lost at one point, and now we are starting to find our way back home, which was the intent. And in the good book, it tells us that we are supposed to follow a God-fearing government. We are supposed to be not led astray and led to believe that we are to be obedient to a nefarious de facto government, okay? The Roman circus, if you will. And we're not supposed to be subservient to that, because you can only serve one master, ladies and gentlemen. And when we look at the Japanese, with the yin and the yang, we understand to have good, there must be evil. To know true happiness, you must have felt the depths of true sorrow, right? The counterbalance of the world, if you will, and on earth. With life comes death, naturally, okay? And so we're looking at the de facto versus the de jure. I hope that I can help you expand your mind and understand that there's a need for the system, okay? I'm not opposed to the system because there are heathens out there. There are people that have ill will out there that are doing wrong, that are doing bad things, and they need to be held accountable. And in 1 Timothy it tells us, it really reaches into my heart and tells me that, the law was not written for a righteous man. And I had to take myself back into time and find out what was exactly meant with those words. And we start to evaluate what the Pharisees were doing. The Pharisees were creating laws for the heathens to follow because they were godless. They were without morality. They were without laws written on their heart, and thus something had to be done to keep them in line, ladies and gentlemen. All right? So again, when we traverse from these modern day books, and I call this a modern day book, it may have been written in the 1800s for all I know, but when we traverse into the modern day books, and we keep in mind what Scripture is telling us, and we can really start to comprehend what is being told to us. So we're moving forward here. Subsection 4, universality of the de facto doctrine, okay? The principles involved in the de facto doctrine are not confined in their application to countries governed by the English law, but must of necessity be recognized in some form or other, right? So we're not completely disregarding the de facto. We're acknowledging there's a necessity and there's a need for it. There's a need because there are heathens, right? And there's a need for them to be there. And either expressly or tacitly by all the civilized nations of the world, history with its endless tales of strife, conflict, and revolution in all parts of the world and in all ages abundantly establishes the truth of this assertion. What abundantly establishes the truth of this assertion? What empire, kingdom, or state can boast of never having had its throne of sovereignty usurped by the conqueror or a revolutionary? If all the acts performed by usurpers and those holding under them, while the affairs of the state are under their control, were to be subsequently declared null and void. And again, sovereignty is had by barrel of the gun according to the de facto. He whose gun is bigger typically makes the rule, all right? And as you know, the bankers, in their cunning, stunning, witty ways, have found a way through paper terrorism to take over the world, all right? There would be no end of confusion, and the restoration of the lawful power would be worse than the usurpation. These views are tersely and eloquently laid down in an American case where it is said, "It is the fundamental maximum not of the law, but of civilized society, that the acts of the officers de facto are valid. Without it, there would be no security for life or liberty or property." It took form and shape in this statute in the time of Edward. As to the rights of a king de facto, but its foundation was beyond that. Without the right of de facto governments, who would recognize the Norman titles against the Saxon barons? Who the varying rights of York and Lancaster, or Tudor and Plantagenet, of king and commonwealth, and king again of Statter and Orange, or Stuart and Orange, or Stuart and Brunswick. Where would you find your resting place in the history of civilization? In the Roman Empire, in its Gothic conquerors, in the house of Charlemagne, in that of Hughes Capet, in the Bourbon or the Bonaparte, the kingdom, the republic, the empire, the kingdom, the republic, the empire again. In 1789 and in 1793, in 1800s, in 1815, in 1848, or in 1852, when, where, and how would you base your rights de jure? Bensberg rises on the ruins of other houses as Habsburg before it, and will fall again, as Habsburg has done. The history of the world is the history of the kingdoms and empires and civilizations de facto becoming de jure because they are de facto. Which leads me to my next point. To say one thing equally imposes and says the other. All right. To deny one thing admits to 100 others. Okay, this is the sound principles and doctrines that I operate by, guys. You just have to listen to the words and let them fill your heart so you can understand. To deny equally admits 100 others. So when you go into a de facto court and you start denying and denying and denying, you equally and oppositely admit to 100 wrongs right out the gate. Subsection 5, historical sketch of the de facto doctrine in England. The de facto doctrine originated in England centuries ago and sprang into existence as soon as circumstances arose calling for its adoption and application. Again, before my phone dies, I just want to say thank you to Mr. Anonymous for sending this to me. The book really kicks off at about 105 pages, and I just want to share the title with you real quick because my phone is going to die. So let's show you what it is so you can find it on the internet. If you can't find it on the internet, I may try and figure out a way to post it on Facebook for you. But my phone's at about 4%, which means it's not going to last much longer, and I apologize. This preface, and the title should be right here. A Treatise on de facto Doctrine, okay? And its relation to public officers and public cooperation based upon the English, American, and Canadian cases, including comments upon the extraordinary legal remedies in reference to the trial of title to offices and corporate existence. All right. That's the name of this book. And I hope that what I have read to you and been able to convey through ascending of the mind and being able to read between the lines and express to you the truth, I hope this leads you into going and ascertaining this 860-page book and having a good read of it. It appears to be written in plain English, which is beautiful. However, you're going to have to be a little learned in order to understand. For example, when I learned about necessity by understanding natural law and comprehending that out of necessity I have the right to hunt and forage for food, which means I don't need to go get a license from a government, a de facto government, in order to forage for food, which means I don't need a license or a fur bearer's permit or whatever to go shoot something that I plan on consuming. All right? So when we look at the doctrine of necessity, it's so important to comprehend. Necessity trumps law, ladies and gentlemen. And remember that contract creates law, equity follows law. That is why no man is alleged to be ignorant of the law. We're all presumed and assumed to be experts in commerce because, after all, ladies and gentlemen, we have been doing it since we've been born, okay? And we just know not what we do because of the way that we've been led to believe in the educational system that we're knowledgeable. And we just overlook it, and we go back to living the life of a serf, being told what to do, believing that freedom is punching in the clock from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and having a beer at 5:30 and going home and watching Married with Children and The Simpsons, and we just think that that's a grand old life, when in reality, our lack of ambition to better ourselves and better our community has caused us to fall into a planned disarray to usurp all our power, ladies and gentlemen. The state can no longer be sovereign because they gave up their sovereignty by giving up their gold and silver. And the de facto comes in and usurps power otherwise not delegated to it due to the condition of the state. But we can revitalize that. We can rejuvenate it, ladies and gentlemen. It is just a mindset. So thank you for joining me this morning. Thanks again for all your donations. I have a page that you can donate on Cash App. I have a Venmo. You can also join selfgovernanceu.com for more great intellectual information to help you, your loved ones, ascend to the mind. If you are blessed enough to have your offspring at home in this time of alleged scandemic, maybe take the opportunity to really get into good educational programming for your loved ones and your offspring. Teach them how to be self-sustaining. Take this opportunity to remove them from the public school system and bring them back home and call them back to the Lord and integrate the power of good scripture, good sound doctrine, and good sound law back into their heart. If you get that opportunity. I know a lot of people right now are a bit confused and overworked, and it's really taking a toll on the family. They're used to being able to have somebody else raise their offspring, and now they've got the what appears to be a burden of taking care of their own offspring again. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not a burden. It should never be perceived to be a burden. It's a blessing that your loved ones are back home with you, where you can take care of them, their minds are developing at this moment in time. It's so imperative. In the first 7 years is when the public school system metamorphs their minds into being useless slaves. Okay, useless feeders, breeders, and eaters is what you are perceived to be by the powers that be, ladies and gentlemen. Now is an opportune time to make a change in your life to better the future for your offspring by instilling in them great traits, qualities, and of course, knowledge. So thanks again for joining me. Thanks again for all the donations, supports, and prayers. Again, we're still in Ohio. We'll be here for a little bit until we can find remedy for the injustice that's been done by the de facto, who, although have a right to be in existence, don't have a right to violate my unalienable rights based upon the pretense of color of law, color of authority, and we'll leave it at that. Thanks again for joining me.